Fourthly, if the king be accountable by law for any act of tyranny done against one man, then much more is he accountable for many done against the whole state. But the former is true. A private man may go to law before the ordinary judges for wronging his inheritance, and the king is made accountable for the wrong done by him. Now, shall the laws be like spider webs, which hold flies, but let bigger beasts pass through? Shall sentence be passed for petty wrongs against a man, and none for tyrannizing over religion, laws, and liberties of the kingdom? Shall none be passed against parricide or fratricide for killing his brother, murdering the nobles, and burning cities? Shall petty thieves be hanged for stealing a sheep? And does the laws of God or man give impunity for robbing a whole country of the nearest and dearest interests they have, to crowned heads for the fancied character of royalty, which is thereby forfeited? Fifthly, if there be judges appointed of God independently, to give out and execute the judgment of the Lord on all offenders, without exception of the highest, then the king also must be subject to that judgment. But there are judges appointed of God independently, to give out and execute the judgment of the Lord on all offenders, without exception of the highest. Two things must be here proved. First, that in giving judgment they do not depend on the king, but are immediate vicars of God. Secondly, that the king is not accepted from, but subject to their judgment in case he be criminal. First, they cannot depend upon the king because they are more necessary than the king, and it is not left to the king's pleasure whether there be judges or not. There may be judges without a king, but there can be no king without judges, nor no justice, but confusion. No man can bear the people's burden alone. Numbers 11, verses 14 and 17. If they depended on the king, their power would die with the king. The streams must dry up the fountain. But that cannot be. For they are not the ministers of the king, but of the kingdom, whose honor and promotion, though by the king's external call, yet comes from God, as all honor and promotion does. Psalm 75, verse 7. The king cannot make judges whom he will, by his absolute power. He must be tied to that law. Deuteronomy 1, verse 13. To take wise men and understanding, and known, neither can he make them during pleasure, for if these qualifications remain, there is no allowance given for their removal. They are God's and the children of the Most High, appointed to defend the poor and fatherless, as well as he. Psalm 82, verses 3 and 6. They were ordained of God for the punishment of evildoers, in which they must not be resisted, as well as he. Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. By me, saith the Lord, rule all the judges of the earth. Proverbs 8, verse 16. To them we must be subject for conscience' sake, as being the ministers of God for good. They must be obeyed for the Lord's sake as well as the king. Though they are sent of him, yet they judge not for man, but for the Lord. 2 Chronicles 19, verse 6. Hence they sit in his room, and are to act as if he were on the bench. The king cannot say, the judgment is mine, because it is the Lord's. Neither can he limit their sentence, as he might if they were nothing but his deputies. Because the judgment is not his, nor are their consciences subordinate to him, but to the Lord immediately. Otherwise, if they were his deputies, depending on him, then they could neither be admonished nor condemned for unjust judgment, because their sentence should neither be righteous nor unrighteous, but as the king makes it. And all directions to them were capable of this exception. Do not so or so, except the king command you. Crush not the poor, oppress not the fatherless, except the king command you. Yea, then they could not execute any judgment, but with the king's license, and so could not be rebuked for their not executing judgment. Now all this is contrary to Scripture, which makes the sentence of the judges undeclinable, when just. Deuteronomy 17, verse 11. The Lord's indignation is kindled when he, quote, looks for judgment, and behold oppression for righteousness, and behold a cry, unquote. Isaiah 5, verse 7. Neither will it excuse the judges to say the king would have it so. For even they that are subservient to, quote, right grievousness to turn aside the needy from judgment, unquote, etc., are under the woe, as well as they that prescribe it. Isaiah 10, verses 1 and 2. The Lord is displeased when, quote, judgment is turned away backward, and judgment stands afar off, unquote. And when there is no judgment, whatever be the cause of it, Isaiah 59, verses 14 and 15. The Lord threatens it will be, quote, avenged on the nation, unquote, when a man is, quote, not found to execute judgment, unquote. Jeremiah 5, verses 1 and 9. and promises if they, quote, will execute judgment in righteousness and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor, unquote. He will give them righteous magistrates, Jeremiah 22, verse 3 and 4. But if they do not, he will send desolation. He rebukes those that, quote, turn judgment to wormwood and leave off righteousness in the earth, unquote. Amos 5, verse 7. He resents it when, quote, the law is slacked and judgment doth not go forth, unquote, freely without overawing and overruling restraint. Habakkuk 1, verse 4. Can these scriptures consist with the judges' dependence on the king's pleasure and the exercise and execution of their power? Therefore, if they would avoid the Lord's pleasure, they are to give judgment, though the king should countermand it. Secondly, that the king is not accepted from their judgment is also evident from the general commands, Genesis 9, verse 6. Quote, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, unquote. There is no exception of kings or dukes here, and we must not distinguish where the law distinguished not. Numbers 35, verses 30 and 31. Whoso killeth any person, the murderer shall be put to death by the mouth of witnesses. Ye shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer which is guilty of death, but he shall be surely put to death. What should hinder then justice to be awarded upon a murdering king? Shall it be for want of witness? It will be easy to adduce thousands. Or shall this be satisfaction for his life, that he is a crowned king? The law saith, there shall be no satisfaction taken. The Lord speaketh too under judges, Leviticus 19:5. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. If kings be not among the mighty, how shall they be classed? Deuteronomy 1:17. You shall not respect persons in judgment, but you shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. If then no man's face can outdare the law and judgment of God, then the king's majestic face must not do it. But as to the demerit of blood, he must be subject as well as another. It is no argument to say that the Sanhedrin did not punish David for his murder and adultery. Therefore, it is not lawful to punish a king for the same. A reason from not doing is not relevant. David did not punish Joab for his murder, but authorized it, as so he did Bathsheba's adultery. Will that prove that murders connived at or commanded by the king shall not be punished, or that whores of state are not to be called to an account? Neither will it prove that a murdering king should not be punished, that David was not punished because he got both the sin pardoned and his life granted from the Lord, saying to him by the mouth of the prophet Nathan, Thou shalt not die. But as for the demerit of that fact, he himself pronounced the sentence out of his own mouth, 2 Samuel 12:15. Quote, As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die, unquote. Quote, So every king condemned by the law is condemned by his own mouth, for the law is the voice of the king. Why, then, do we so much weary ourselves concerning a judge, seeing we have the king's own confession, that is, the law? Unquote. Buchanan, De Jure Regino. And there needs be no other difficulty to find a tribunal for a murdering king than to find one for a murder. For a judgment must acknowledge but one name, that is, of the crime. If a king then be guilty of murder, he hath no more the name of a king, but of a murderer. When brought to judgment, for he is not judged for kingship, but for his murder, as when a gentleman is judged for robbery, he is not hanged, neither is he spared because he is a gentleman, but because he is a robber. See Buchanan above. Sixthly, if the people's representatives be superior to the king in judgment, and may execute judgment without him and against his will, then they may also seek account of him. But if he hath no power but from them, and no power without them to act as king, no more than the eye or hand hath power to act without the body, then his power must be inferior, fiduciary, and accountable to them. But the former is true, and the people's representatives are superior to the king in judgment, and may execute judgment without him and against his will. In Scripture we find the power of the elders and heads of the people was very great, and in many cases superior to the king, which the learned Dr. Owen demonstrates in his preliminary exercitations on the epistle to the Hebrews, and proves out of the rabbins that the kings of the Jews might have been called to an account and punished for transgressing of the law. But in the Scripture we find, first, they had a power of judgment with the supreme magistrate in matters of religion, justice, and government. Hamor and Shechem would not make a covenant with Jacob's sons without the consent of the men of the city. Genesis 34, verse 20. David behooved to consult with the captains of thousands and every leader, if it seemeth good, to bring again the ark of God. 1 Chronicles 13, verses 1, 2, and 3. So also Solomon could not do it without them. 1 Kings 8, verse 1. Ahab could not make peace with Ben-Hadad against the consent of the people. 1 Kings 20, verse 8. The men of Ephraim complained that Jephthah, the supreme magistrate, had gone to war against the children of Ammon without them, and threatened to burn his house with fire, which he only excuses by the law of necessity. Judges 12, verse 1, 2, and 3. The 70 elders are appointed of God, not to be the advisors only and helpers of Moses, but to bear a part of the burden of ruling and governing the people, that Moses might be eased. Numbers 11, verses 14 and 17. Moses, upon his sole pleasure, had not power to restrain them in the exercise of judgment given to God. They were not the magistrate's dependent deputies, but in the act of judging they were independent, and their conscience as immediately subjected to God as to the superior magistrate, who is to add his approbative suffrage to their actings, but not his directive nor imperative suffrage of absolute pleasure, but only according to the law. He might command them to do their duty, but he could do nothing without them. Secondly, they had power, not derived from the prince at all, even a power of life and death. The rebellious son was to be brought to the elders of the city, who had power to stone him. Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 to 24. They had power to punish adultery with death. Deuteronomy 22, verse 21. They had power to cognos whom to admit into, and whom to seclude from the cities of refuge, so that the king had commanded to take the life of an innocent man, they were not to deliver him. Joshua 20, throughout. But besides the elders of cities, there were the elders and heads of the people, who had judicial power to cognos on all criminal matters. Even when Joshua was judge in Israel, we find they assumed this power to judge of that matter of the 2 tribes and the half. Joshua 22, verse 30. And they had power to make kings, as Saul and David, as was showed. And it must needs follow, they had power to unmake them in case of tyranny. Thirdly, they had power to convene, even without the indiction of the ruler, as in that Joshua 22. They convene without him, and without advice or knowledge of Samuel, the ruler. They convene to ask a king, 1 Samuel 8. And without any head or superior, they convene and make David king, notwithstanding of Ishbosheth's hereditary right. Without and against tyrannous Athaliah's consent, they convene and make Joash king, and cared not for her treason. 2 Kings 11. But now the king alone challenges the prerogative power of calling and dissolving parliaments as he pleases, and condemns all meetings of estates without his warrant, which is purely tyrannical. For in cases of necessity, by the very law of nature, they may and must convene. The power is given to the king only by a positive law for order's sake, but otherwise they have an intrinsical power to assemble themselves. All the forecighted commands, admonitions, and certifications to execute judgment must necessarily involve and imply a power to convene, without which they could not be in a capacity for it. Not only unjust judgment, but no judgment, in a time when truth has fallen in the streets and equity cannot enter, is charged as the sin of the state. Therefore they must convene to prevent this sin, and the wrath of God for it. God hath committed the keeping of the commonwealth not only to the kings only, but also to the people's representatives and heads. And if the king hath power to break up all conventions of this nature, then he hath power to hinder judgment to proceed, which the Lord commands, and this would be an excuse when God threatens vengeance for it. We would not execute judgment because the king forbade us, yet many of these forementioned reproofs, threatenings, and certifications were given in the time of tyrannous and idolatrous kings, who, no doubt, would inhibit and discharge the doing of their duty. Yet we see that was no excuse, but the Lord denounces wrath for the omission.